this lesson, we will continue our discussions of fiscal policy in Australia by looking at the objectives and the primary functions of fiscal policy. To start, let's explore the objectives of fiscal policy. The objective of the Australian government fiscal policy are outlined in the 1998 Charter of Budget Amnesty Act. There, it's written that the government fiscal policy is to be directed to maintaining the ongoing economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia, and is therefore to be set in a sustainable medium-term framework. To meet this objective, the government fiscal strategy is to be based on the principle of sound fiscal management. So what does it mean to have a sustainable medium-term framework? What are the principles of sound fiscal management? Well, by and large, this means that the government is tasked to ensure that the government debt is maintained at prudent and sustainable levels, taking into account the overall economic circumstances. In practical terms, the government needs to make sure that the overall debt is not too large and that they have the means to pay the debt in the future or over the medium term without endangering the prosperity and welfare of Australia's future generation. It also means that the government needs to ensure that their fiscal policy decisions contribute to achieving adequate national saving and to moderating cyclical fluctuation in overall economic activity. This later point on moderating cyclical fluctuations is related to one of the primary functions of fiscal policy, which we will discuss shortly. Now let's take a look at the historical evolutions of the Australian government net debt from 1970 up to 2017 to 18 financial year. Net debt is defined as financial liabilities or gross debt less the amount of liquid financial assets. Here, we will focus on the net debt of the Commonwealth government. As we can see in this graph, except for several years in early 1970s and from 2006 to 2009, the Australian government's net debt position is usually positive. The average net debt level over this period is 6.8% of GDP. In the latest data in the figure in 2017 to 18 financial year, the net debt level is 342 billion Australian dollars, or 18.5% of GDP, with the gross debt to GDP ratio is calculated to be 40.5%. Does the Australian government have the means to pay this amount of debt? Is this amount sustainable over the medium term? Well, though not definitive, a gross debt to GDP ratio of 60% is often mentioned, for example, by the IMF, as a prudential limit for developed countries. So by that measure, 40.5% gross debt to GDP ratio is not that high and is actually quite sustainable. Despite this arguably already quite sustainable level, the government indicates that in the 2018-19 budget that the net debt is set to fall to 3.8% of GDP by 2028 to 2029. Another statistic that we can use to assess fiscal sustainability is the government budget balance. In this figure, we see that since 2009, the Commonwealth government has been running a budget deficit every year, meaning that the government debt has been increasing since then. It is projected that the deficit will continue until the 2019-2020 financial year. Starting from 2020 to 21 financial year, the government plans to run a budget surplus. This budget surplus is needed to support the government's medium-term objective of reducing the amount of government debt. Now that we know the objective of fiscal policy in Australia, we can now explore the functions of fiscal policy. How can fiscal policy be used by the government to maintain the ongoing economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia? Find out in the next lecture.